Okay, well, John, you called this topic, so do you want to start us out?
I do want to start us out. So, there are three things I think we can really talk about here. We have the musical itself. So I think that's probably how we should start out. What are your reactions to the musical? How did you respond to it as historians, right? Because we're all historians here. And then, after we discuss the musical itself, then we should probably turn our attention to the two journal articles. We've got two historians with very different opinions. One of the two historians, Eisenberg, is calling out Hamilton for essentially being bad history. And Eisenberg's argument is that the people, the audience is viewing this, are interpreting Hamilton as history. And if that is the case, then it should be held up to certain historical standards. And Eisenberg is arguing that it is not. And then on the other hand, you have Karp, who's arguing that we shouldn't view this as history at all, that it is a work of art and audiences largely understand it as such. And so the question should be, what does this do for historians, right? Is this, does this have a positive impact on the field of history or not? And what I can tell you is one of the reasons I assigned those two readings is I actually was at the panel that this was discussed at Shear that year. I wanted to assign another reading, but I decided it would just get too complicated. One of the other panelists on this panel, who was actually cited by both of the historians, was a guy by the name of Andy Shockett, who was my master's thesis advisor. And this is the interesting thing here. He's actually getting pretty high up in Shear. I would not be at all surprised if he ends up president eventually. He's that high up in the echelons. Anyway, I was at the panel, and it was a very interesting discussion. But it did indeed hinge on the question that these two historians have, and that is, how should we interpret what Hamilton is? Is it a work of history, or is it something else, right? So I'd like to look at all of those questions, but I think we really should start with your initial responses to the musical itself. I mean, as historians, how did you respond to this?
I guess I can start. I am so this is the first movie if movie you can call it, that I've seen in probably a year and a half. I usually don't even watch anything just because as a historian and stuff, I'm afraid to watch things and then get confused with the facts and have it the myth become a perception of reality. So it was one thing, when I was watching it right from the get-go, I was okay, I gotta look up a biography of Hamilton so I can see what's really true, and then I can kind of base it off of that. For me, it helped, I had the captions on so I could stop and pause, because some of the things that they did were kind of confusing. I mean, it was a lot, I had just went to an opera on Monday, and this was a lot better than that.
Okay.
So I could at least understand everything. I thought it was really good as far as production, and a lot of things flowed well, but I could definitely see some things that kind of raised my little historian red flag, when they mentioned Sally Hemings with Thomas Jefferson and how he's oh, this really great guy, and I'm oh, so you're a great guy if the person you're sleeping with is a slave, but because the other person's white, you're not. These kind of things just kind of jumped up at me right away. And I think that's the kind of stuff that stuck with me more. I think now reflecting on it, because I watched it last night, the next day, is just some things didn't sit right in those red flags kind of stayed with me more than necessarily maybe the things that were right.
So it sounds to me like as you were watching as you were watching the musical, you were constantly filtering it and questioning to yourself, is this a plausible historical interpretation or not? And I think one of the questions that's interesting to ask, and it's worth asking because it's brought up by Karp, one of the historians, is that the response that you're getting from a wider audience, right?
Yeah, because I had taught my dad and my mom. My dad made me mad one day, so I was like, Mom, you and Dad should watch Hamilton. So I made him get stuck watching the movie. That's kind of what I do.
Well, there you go.
To get back at him. So we were talking about it this morning, and he thought it was great, like, for history. And I was like, but Dad, this, he's like, I don't care about that. Like the thing that I talked about, like Sally Hemings and stuff. For him, it didn't matter because that's not why he's watching it. So I think that, for me, I really did have a real world example of, like an everyday person, and then someone who is looking at it from a different view, and our like discussion on it, which basically we were just fighting in the end because you can't. We just had a hard time talking about it because we were looking for such different things out of the work that we couldn't bridge that gap.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. And, I think that's one of the things that historians are grappling with this particular, theater production is historians, even historians who, the ones that are supportive of it, there's a disconnect between the historian's approach to this musical and the approach from, the general public. And this brings up the interesting question, what role does popular history have, right? And we're not just talking theater productions, we're talking, historical fiction, we're talking the work of popular historians. One of the ones who's been better at doing is David McCullough. Is that a name that rings a bell to some of you guys? I mean, he sort of has his foot in, yes to you two, but I like Kate and Emily, you're on my right hand side of the screen, so it looks like you guys are like, who's David McCullough? But he is one of those few historians who has his foot in academia, one foot in academia, but he also has a foot in, in writing books that are like New York Times bestsellers. And so it brings up the question, there's an uneasy relationship between historians and popular history. And I think you see this playing out with Hamilton. Yeah, Dan.
I would add, I agree with you, John, and I would add that, and even more so between popular biographers and kind of and sort of mainstream history. And Ron Chernow, whose, biography Lin-Manuel Miranda used extensively for this, is, along with other people like Walter Isaacson, write these, write biographies of people like Ben Franklin and John Adams and Hamilton, and they're very, they are criticized sometimes as being rather one-sided and rather hagiographical, that they make these people into omniscient, kind of saint-like characters.
And yet, the public just laps them up.
Yeah.
And Kate, what do you think?
I think your question of like, how do we take this as something that's actually historical or something that's popular? I think it makes sense because nobody wants to people want drama. That's why they go and watch a movie. That's why they go to see these films and Broadway, is they want that excitement, that drama. There's one person who is the protagonist and they want to support that person. So I can see how they took certain aspects of Hamilton's life and the actual history behind him and turned him into a positive character so that everybody kind of gets behind him. And I think that's where we kind of get this disconnect where what's true and what's cinema.
So does good history make for bad theater, cinema?
I think you can argue that, but the way that
I'm gonna go there.
well, I'm just, if you think about like the way we look at cinema and production now, it is that one way of, we want a protagonist, we want one person to support. And so, yeah, that kind of contradicts real life. Like, that's not real life. That's a fairy tale, that there's one good person and that person is always right. And that person, so
Right. And there is a narrative arc that we expect to see. Right. And there are these tropes of storytelling. And one thing that I would add, that I would throw in, oh, hey, Melissa.
Hey.
One thing that I would throw in is that this is the thing that really impressed me about, to John's first question about the musical itself. This was the best storytelling I have seen in a long time in the form of song. I mean, that song when, what's her name? Antoinette, the sister, stop,
Angelica.
Okay, yes, I'm sorry, Angelica. Yeah, your sister Angelica. I should remember that. They just go through this meeting and wedding scene, and then she basically rewinds that, and it's like so right in the moment. It's like, okay, we rewind that. We're gonna go through. We're gonna shift it to this perspective, and we're gonna go through that same scene again. All of those moves, but look at it from this perspective. I mean, that was just insanely great storytelling. And so that's what I appreciated about it. I think it got most of the, it named the right names. So if you're interested, I thought you could go and look at the footnotes and find out the real stories of these people. But I sort of ignored that, and I just went at that moment, I was like, I was sucked into the story, and I didn't really care if it matched up with the.
I agree with you 100%. That whole part interested me too, and so I think also we can kind of say that this might be a good starting spot, where you get intrigued, look more into who they were, and maybe go into more of a historical research about these people. And that's kind of where I was too. I was like, oh, I didn't know that he had he was interested in the other sister but was married to one sister. So I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And so then that can prompt maybe somebody who's not into history and say, oh, well, was that true, and what about them, and did they really have this love affair? And I think that it kind of makes people want to learn about them.
And that was the point, like you see it as a theme in the essay that you read from Karp, and in the actual conference session, that's the one he was really hitting home on, is, this isn't a perfect representation of what happened, but it is certainly intriguing the public and drawing the public into an interest in history, right? I mean, and, we historians shouldn't be quibbling about something that, if we funnel and we channel right, could be, wonderful for history. I mean, Karp's argument was, think about all the potential history majors we might get out of this, and he has a point.
And he says, and on 293, he's talking about one of the things from a historian perspective that I liked was sort of the recurring theme of you have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, to your point, John, we as historians have no control what parts of that story people hear and what parts of it resonate with them and what parts they, you know, they care about. And so that's sort of the other half of that equation. You know, not only do these historical characters have no control who tells their story, but you know, the storytellers really have less control than they'd like to have. You know, what parts of the story, you know, people, you know, the serious history part, or you know, the inspiring, you know, or crazy part. Personally, I appreciated the fact that Jefferson comes off as kind of a jackass in this show, because he's so. I mean, we're so already so you know, reverential about Jefferson.
But okay, so this is a question, I mean, I specifically want to hear from Tom and Emily and Melissa, because you were in the historiography class, but then maybe after you three chip in, I want to hear, Kate and Dan, what you think. I mean, what if you turn this argument on its head, though? It seems to me there is a general consensus among the people who've talked so far that this isn't history, and it is a work of fiction. But, you know, there's many historians who acknowledge and argue that history itself is partly fictive, right? I mean, that's something we talked about in our historiography course. Yeah. And many historians do approach history to create a narrative, right? It has a narrative structure. So if there are similarities between a work of fiction that conveys past events, conveys history, and historians' works who have fictive elements in what they are constructing, therefore, isn't it fair to criticize Miranda for not paying more attention to, you know, actual veracity? Let's put it that way.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, he wrote it as a musical, and I think going in, it's partially it's for entertainment value, partially it's for educational value, depending on who's going to see it and whatnot. And I think, I mean, from what I've heard earlier, you guys were talking about when I came in, was it's opening doors to people for history. So I think it's a good way. It's a good way for people to ask questions, to find out, like, facts versus fiction in history, I guess. But I think at the end of the day, it is a musical. So.
And although I completely agree with you, I kind of made that same point. Do you guys think people will actually ask those questions? What is fiction and what is real? Because as Emily pointed out, her dad who watched it was like, I don't care what's the truth and what's not. Is that going to be something that most people will think about? Or is there going to be people who are speculating what is true and what's not?
May I ask how egregious were the errors presented in this musical? After all, it is a musical, and for me at least, I had never heard of the Schuler family at all before, and pretty much virtually nothing about Hamilton other than that he makes an appearance on a $10 bill and had a duel with Burr. Boom. So at least for me, it advanced my interest in that part of American history. And in addition, I think also it's an interesting reflection on our current times. Would have Hamilton succeeded, let's say in the mid-50s or right after World War II? No, it's a,
No,
you know, you
exactly.
couldn't tell. And like musicals, things have to go pretty much well, pretty good. There has to be a hero, flawed with foibles and whatnot, but there has to be this kind of ultimate triumph at the end, unless, of course, it's Bertolt Brecht.
Right.
So I don't know.
Well, you know, I mean, I guess that's part of what I'm getting at. In order to have Hamilton conform to fictive tropes,
Yeah,
the actual person of Hamilton is re-thingamajiggered into a tragic hero. And
along the way into a populist and, you know, kind of a Democrat and, and the guy who wins the Revolutionary War and elects Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
Which is none of which is, you know, is really that accurate.
Right. I think the single factual representation that's probably the most skewed is when it talks about the election of 1800.
okay.
Which
which is a basis for the duel, right? And
right.
that's kind of where where they pull that thread out of, right? Because supporters of Burr do sort of take umbrage at the fact that something that's attributed to Hamilton is seen as sort of weighing in on on the election and coming down on the Jefferson side, and that sort of boils over time and leads to accusations going in both directions, and sort of that not as straightforward as the challenge response scenes in the musical itself, but sort of leading towards that ultimate towards the duel.
I mean, I guess the question I'm getting at is, by portraying Hamilton as a tragic hero, does this thereby whitewash history and do history a disservice? I mean, if you have studied Hamilton, he's a very, well, like all human beings, he's filled with contradictions and bundles of gray. And I think the first historian, Eisenberg, did a pretty good job explaining why historians who take issue with the depiction of Hamilton do so. Hamilton's portrayed as having the purest of motives most of the time, and even when he's flawed, it's a tragic flaw, right? It's a literary trope. You're meant to sympathize with him. But in reality, this is a guy who was a political actor, and yes, he wrote against slavery, but was he against slavery because he actually opposed slavery, or was he trying to win brownie points, right? Because there was a large anti-slavery faction within the Federalists, which was spearheaded by John Adams, who was the guy who was actually anti-slavery, right? There's a lot in Hamilton that is attributed in the musical to the purest of motives. When you look at the guy in real life, he's a political actor, and he wasn't nearly as anti-slavery, and he certainly wasn't pro-immigrant, despite all these lyrics. Keep in mind, he's Federalist Party, Alien and Sedition Act. It was an anti-immigrant party. This is a guy in real life who wanted no one to bring up his immigrant status, right? He was running away from that his entire life. He was not wearing it on his sleeve. So, you know, I guess what I'm suggesting here, and this is specifically, it's tied to what you were saying, Kate. And I think to a degree what you were saying too, Tom, if what is good about Hamilton is it draws a popular audience's interest in history, is that really a problematic statement? Because is the history it's doing not necessarily the type of history historians want to do, right? I mean, you know, this is like a very good guy, bad guy portrayal of history.
I think you could argue, though, that that's a common thread, especially with the founding fathers, especially in modern times. I know, you know, with gun rights and with women's rights and all people are created equal, we have this almost fairy tale idea of who the founding fathers were, and that's not just Hamilton that we have that idea of. It's Washington, it's Jefferson, and so I think you can argue that although this musical itself definitely does idolize Hamilton, do we not do that ourselves when we learn about Hamilton? Because when I learned about Hamilton growing up, it was, he was the treasurer, and that he got shot in a duel. That's all I learned about him, that he was this really good guy. But you know, I didn't learn extensively about him. So
yeah, Eisenberg kind of complains that you know, that Aaron Burr gets his typical sort of raw deal. And you're right, Kate. We do. I mean, this is something that we already do with the founding fathers, right? And we don't do it as much with Hamilton. So it's sort of like, okay, so now the musical has given Hamilton his moment, you know, in the same way that 1776, you know, gave Washington and Jefferson their moments, you know, or whatever. And so, you know, so now he's sort of fully part of that pantheon. Aaron Burr is still on the outside looking in, you know, never in the room where it happened.
He's an awfully hard guy to salvage. I mean, you got, you know, you guys know what happened after the duel, right? With Aaron Burr. He's the guy that went to Louisiana, right? Tried to set up a government of his own. So
and got into talks with Britain about maybe trying to reverse the outcome of the revolution.
He really, you know, given the narrative structure of American history, if you want a real challenge as a historian, he's never really had a positive image since the 1800 election. So this would be a real challenge, but
it would be a huge challenge to
create a positive portrayal of Aaron Burr. If you could pull that off,
I think you could. I think it would be easier to rehabilitate Benedict Arnold than Aaron Burr. Honestly.
Oh, I absolutely agree.
The first irony, the first moment, actually, I actually paused the thing and turned to Steph and I said, "I'm not going to miss my shot. Remember that line, because that's why he dies, right? Is because he doesn't take his shot, right? So it's kind of ironic that you go all the way, you go through that story with this thing in your head. And that is, and I think that's not only ironic, but I also think that may be the one thing, and I don't know the Chernow biography well enough to know if Miranda really gets it from Chernow, but that idea that this is the story of this brash young guy who goes through his life like this, like one of these typical heroes, like a Steve Jobs or somebody who's I'm not gonna miss my shot. I'm not gonna miss my shot. That may be, if there is a sort of historical error or a historical crime in this narrative, that might be it right there, portraying him in that way.
One question I had for you guys, because I wasn't really sure after I watched the video, I went and looked over a couple of biographies about Hamilton, and in the musical they portrayed him as almost towards the end as almost docile. That's the interpretation I got anyways, that he didn't want to fight, he didn't want to shoot Burr, and that he raised his gun up at the sky at the end. But when I was reading about him, he had up to, I think what I was reading, up to like 10 duels before he actually died. So do you think that self that he didn't mean to shoot, or he meant to not shoot Burr, do you think that's something that historians have altered themselves, or do you think that that's factual?
I don't know for sure, but the reading that I've done suggests that he was not intending to try to kill Burr. That he had sort of pre-planned that he was going to fire into the air. I don't know, and I don't know anything about the this part of the story in the musical where his son fights the same duel and he gives him that advice and all of that. I don't know if any of that is accurate, or if that's just a way of sort of interjecting the thought process at the end into the story so that you remember it, when it comes time for his duel to happen.
My understanding is that he did not intend to shoot Burr either, but I want to tie it to something else you said. You said, Kate, that it was portraying him as docile at the end, and I think that's part of it. Miranda was trying to portray him as a tragic hero, right? But what Miranda leaves out is that Hamilton in the 1800 election was he wrote a series of newspaper articles where he came out against Adams, and we're talking super personal character attacks. And I think so again, you see the actual factoids in Hamilton are not wildly inaccurate, right? I mean, if you look at the individual factoids, it's hard to point at one and say, okay, well, that's dead wrong. It's not like Patriot in that sense, but there's a lot that's left out in order to get it to adhere to certain fictive tropes. And historians make the same choices too, right? They're not going to describe everything about the people that they're describing if they're writing a biography. They have to make choices as historians, just as Miranda did. But it does get to the question of, well, is there a point where too much is left out of some of this, right? Because as you said, Hamilton is portrayed and as docile, but he was doing the same types of things that Jefferson was. You know, Jefferson, there's that whole scene where Jefferson is trying to dig up the dirt with Hamilton, right? Hamilton was digging up the same dirt on his political opponents. So, you know, I guess it is interesting to think, okay, well, are audiences looking at this with the same critical lens that we are? Is the public looking at it with the same critical lens and asking, okay, you know, can we accept this as the truth, or is this an interpretation of the truth? And I'm not sure. I think that's the real question. And I think that's the difference that you see between Eisenberg and Karp. Karp specifically says the public is not viewing this as history.
Right.
But I think Eisenberg is assuming that, yes, the public is viewing this as quote unquote, the truth. That's the real question. Dan, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking that there's another moment at the end where, and it's funny because I read a review before I watched it, and then I thought, oh, it's going to be a spoiler, so I stopped. But I remember noticing that the reviewer said, you know, and then at the end when Miranda, as you know, and the reviewer, she thought that they break the fourth wall at the end, and you know, and Miranda, you know, as Miranda takes Eliza to, you know, the front of the stage, and you know, and she breaks the fourth wall and she sees the audience, and you know, and sees, you know, sort of the, you know, the historic significance of, you know, of her life or whatever, and has that moment where she gasps and, you know, and then the curtain falls, and so that is an intervention in sort of history that Miranda is making as well, you know, so, sort of focusing on the 50 years that she lives after his death, right? Mm-hmm. and sort of reorienting our attention on that, because she, I mean, and she deliberately, you know, throughout the production is saying, I'm taking myself out of the narrative, putting myself back into the narrative. And you know, and giving her sort of agency as a historical actor is, I think, an intervention in history that historians ought to consider serious and relevant.
Yeah, I see your point. But do you think, to play devil's advocate a little bit, do you think that this perhaps is an example of what Eisenberg is calling out as faux feminism by having, you know, the Schuyler's portrayed in the light that they are as, well, quote unquote, modern women, right?
It's having that agency at the beginning and saying, oh, we've read Paine, and, you know, we've read your declaration, Mr. Jefferson, and in the second, you know, edition, you know, add the women and all of that. I thought that was the faux feminist moment, but the end, I thought, was, I think the end is more difficult to write off as faux. I think it's revisionist.
Mm-hmm.
But and it's refocusing. I mean, it's actually kind of social historical. It's refocusing on, you know, on everybody else's history from the, you know, from the bottom or the lower echelons upwards. You know, because we tend to focus on these great men and the things that they did in political history. So up until this point, it's been very much a political history of, you know, the Revolution, the early Republic. And now all of a sudden it becomes kind of, we have this social historical moment where I said, well, there's other ways, there's other people in this story to think about, you know, and so that is kind of an intervention in the way we think of this period and who we think is important in this period. That's just a you know, an argument, I guess. I don't know how committed I am to that, but I thought it was interesting.
What do the four of you feel? Do you agree with do you agree or disagree with Eisenberg's argument that the portrayal of the Schuyler sisters was faux feminism?
Can I just throw out, you know, I gotta come in with my conspiracy. Throw out giving Eliza those, what is it, not even 2 minutes worth, claiming all the things that she did. Could that be almost a portrayal of how impactful it was on this time? You know, this whole story is about Hamilton, and then right at the very end, you know, she gets a little snippet, and now it talks about how feminist she was. Could that, almost, like I said, almost be a portrayal of how important it was during that time period and how little impact it had on the history of that time? If that makes sense, I don't know.
I'm trying to, I want to make sure I understand you right. So you're arguing that because she did not have a more significant role in it, Miranda was acknowledging that or...
But okay, so if he was trying, personally, this is my personal opinion, but I think that if he was trying to portray her as this really big feminist, that it would have occurred more throughout her role in this musical. You know, she was the wife, the mourning mother. She never stood up and was this very significant feminist throughout the whole musical until the very end. And so I think that if he was trying this, and again, this is just my opinion, if he was trying to portray her as this feminist, I think that her ideals and her opinions would have occurred more throughout the musical.
Well, actually, that's what I was trying to say, but I did not say it as well. So I'm glad you said it. I guess what I was trying to get to what you were saying, Dan, and what you're saying, Kate, is it seems like she's there in a supportive role, and she's dropped at an important moment, but it seems like a drop, right? It doesn't necessarily seem integral. And that's the way, like, that's what I was trying to get at, that even the last scene to me felt faux feminist, because it didn't exactly feel integral. It just felt like, okay, well, I'm going to add this at the end to make this exclamation point, right? Regarding the Schuyler sisters. I don't know. It may just have been my response.
I guess the only last thing that I'll say to support my argument that I just thought of at the, you know, on the spur of the moment.
I'm not trying to attack you, I promise.
He wrote this in 2009. Miranda did, right after the financial crisis. So the other thing that sort of resonates with me is that, you know, at the end, when they're sort of summing up, Jefferson says, you know, he created this banking system. He created Wall Street, right? And it couldn't be dismantled. And I know I tried, right? And so you've got, so it's 2009. He's writing this. You've got the financial crisis still in everybody's mind. Hamilton is the author of that, right? And then you've got the woman, and what's the thing that you remember that she does after he dies? She establishes the first orphanage in New York City, right? And so she does something for people. So I think it is a question. I mean, I think a decision like that to end on her, yes, I think it does. You know, it's politically correct, so it scores points that way. but I think it also juxtaposes these two legacies, right? You've got, Hamilton's legacy is Wall Street and the financial crisis, and Eliza's legacy is orphanages and, and I'll just go to the extreme, and by extension, the Occupy movement, right? The stuff that the parts of New York society that are oriented towards the welfare of people, especially the poor. And then I guess I'll go in the other direction and say one of the things that bugged me most about the ahistoricism of this is the centrality of New York City to everything. New York City was not the center of the revolution. New York City was occupied until 2 years after the war was over, until 1783. And it was a hotbed of royalist, and loyalist, action. So, yeah.
So, Emily, you were going to say something.
Yeah. And this might be like a little muddled because I can't quite grasp what I'm trying to say, but just to go back to Eliza for like a second, like I just took like the Shakespeare class this last semester, and during part of it, I'm only bringing this up because it was in the play where he compares like Adams to Banquo and stuff. Like that was the play Macbeth, and one of the beginning things about that play Macbeth they talk about is Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, and by extension, like Manuel's kind of saying Hamilton is like Macbeth, and she's Lady Macbeth. And one of the things they always talk about is like who had the most agency and who's to blame for killing that Macduff figure. Mm-hmm. So I think that he kind of does address it in the play, like what with Eliza, because people who blame Macbeth don't blame Macbeth turn to Lady Macbeth. So I don't know if I'm getting what I'm trying to say out like clearly, but like I think like he's trying to say, he addresses it in a way that's very kind of very, very, very subtle. Like I had to stop and think about it myself, but because here he is addressing the most famous stage artist, playwright of all time, Shakespeare, and his work, and like, is it significant that he does that at that point? And is it significant that that extension is made or not? I don't know. I for you, I don't know. Maybe I'm just like too far out there, just trying to make ends.
No, I don't think you are. I hadn't thought about that. I think it's a really good point.
I think it's a good point. I think it's also ironic that it's a huge Broadway taboo never to mention Macbeth, right? And so he goes there. He's like, I'm going there. He does that with all of this stuff.
So I'm not very versed in Macbeth, but basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, they turn from Macbeth to Lady Macbeth at the end of the play. Is that like to put blame on somebody, or how can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's this figure in like the time period. Macbeth is supposed to be the next king, but the current king, Macduff, changes the succession. So when Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are talking, they're saying we need to kill the king before he makes the succession change. And so people like reading the play are like, who's more at fault for that decision being made to kill him? Because Macbeth is the one who killed him, but Lady Macbeth basically told him, like, you're not going to be a man if you don't do this. Like, if you don't stand up for your right, you're just going to be, So it's that question of who is at fault. Was it Macbeth because he is the one that killed him, or is it Lady Macbeth because she's the one who's like, you need to do this? Like, it's a really big like question of the play, like the question of agency in that play, like whose decision was it?
Okay. And you're making that connection as was it Eliza or was it Hamilton that had the agency in the play. Is that what you're getting at there?
I was just kind of going off of what you guys were saying, like with the financial stuff, and like with Eliza, like that is a big question. She talks about like the narrative and stuff. How much agency is there for her?
Yep.
Tom, what are you thinking?
Well, I was thinking about Lady Macbeth. And theirs was a love story. And the death was greatly plotted, and Lady Macbeth makes a great deal about becoming her. Unsex me now.
Mm-hmm.
That she would do it, but it is up to him. I think the intensity between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is missing in Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that was going through my mind, again, I've been basically listening and learning from what you guys are saying. I'm trying to think of other musicals that have had to do with political characters other than Evita, that have captured the American imagination. And toss that out there. Does anybody?
Well, 1776 did, I think. But that's getting to be pretty old, right? Because that was a musical, wasn't it? Pretty sure it was.
Music in it.
Yeah.
Oh, there have been countless plays, of course, that have had to deal with the historical figures. But as musicals, as sing and dance and.
Well, let me think about that.
And Evita is the only one I can think of. So, what does it mean? It means utterly known, but.
Well, yeah, I think you're right about, I mean, there's other musicals that are loosely based on historical events because they're based on novels that are loosely based on historical events.
Right.
Like Les Mis, but nothing. Yeah, I get what you're saying.
But to go back to the question in the two articles, do you think that that seeing Hamilton would make people more or less interested in actually learning about these events?
Absolutely.
So from that perspective,
absolutely,
it could be judged as being a win for historians, even though, Eisenberg in her last couple of paragraphs is complaining about power, and about how historians don't have enough power, professional historians don't have enough power, to impose their truth on the world. But I think it did something for history that it.
One thing I would have almost liked to see is maybe at the end, obviously this is musical, so it couldn't have happened in real life, but maybe at the end or during the performance, I think what could have enticed people to do more research is maybe some sources or some actual historical facts put in there, because all we're doing is we're watching it happen. If maybe there was something at the end that said, if you're interested, here's more, or at the beginning, or throughout, little fun factoids that are thrown in throughout the musical, I think that could maybe entice people more to do more research, because everybody, people who watch it, they're gonna be like, oh, that was a great entertainment. Who knows that people will actually go through and research it. Me, myself, I was intrigued, and I've always kind of been intrigued with Hamilton, even before Hamilton came out. And so this probably will prompt me to go and do more research about him and his life and his family and so on and so forth. But I don't know that that most people who are not interested in history will take this and be like, well, what is the truth? So I don't know, maybe there could have been something that was put in there to encourage people to look into.
There was one moment where Miranda turns to the camera and he says, "That happened. That was true." At the beginning of the first act, and I thought, oh, maybe there'll be more of that, pointing out the real stuff in the parentheses.
This kind of reminds me of a conversation we had in historiography about like documentaries and films and stuff. Are they good history compared to like writings or like books and novels or whatever? And I remember, I don't think I said much on it at the time, but I know I definitely thought about that, because to me, I'm not a reading person. I don't like sitting down and reading, but if I have something I can visually see in front of me, I think I take more from that. So I think people who go and see Hamilton, they're gaining more information, as maybe they're going to see as entertaining, but they're also learning, because some people aren't going to go and pick up a book and read about Hamilton, So I think it's definitely a way to get interested, like, easily, without having to sit and flip through pages of whether you think it's like boring or not or whatever. Because I got into history because of documentaries. I watched them all the time as a kid, so I know it definitely wasn't like opening a textbook and reading. So I think Hamilton in itself, even though it's a musical, but it's like a gateway. It itself may not be history, like, well, but it's a door.
That's a great analogy, Melissa. It's a gateway drug for history.
There you go. Yeah, Tom, or are you just getting a thumbs
I
up?
was just giving a thumbs up. It's a door. Perfect.
So, okay, I got to ask you guys this question, because if this question needs to get asked, especially since this is getting posted online, because this is one of the biggest things about this musical, and no one has brought this up. What do you guys feel about the creative decision to have
White actors?
largely minority actors play white roles, essentially?
I was going to point that out earlier, but I didn't want to distract from the conversation that we were having. But I loved it. I at first I was confused. I was like, maybe this person that I don't know a whole lot about was actually not white or something. And then I was like, wait, no. And then so I looked into it, and I really did enjoy the fact that they played non-white actors played white characters, and I thought that was brilliant. And kind of, even though there weren't any actual black characters, I liked the fact, or minority characters, I liked the fact that they were actors in the musical.
Yeah, like one of my, like, I don't know why, but I've been watching like a lot of reality TV because I have Hulu now. So like one of the things, this is like a little bit of like a digression, but I'm getting there. So I watched like Dance Moms. I don't know if you guys maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
One of the things, she always typecasts. That's like her thing. And a lot of the parents get really upset about that, because when you typecast, you're limiting what they can do, not only what like the dancers were doing, but like the story you're telling. So for me, it was really cool to see, just coming from this, what Abby Lee Miller always says, she makes Broadway dancers. That's what she's doing. She's making professional dancers. And to see that idea that she had being turned on its head because this stage didn't do that, you know, that was really cool to see. I mean, even though this had been filmed, you know, I think in probably around the same time, they're probably pretty contemporary, you know, to see how someone was kind of differently. And it was, I liked it. I thought that was a really great thing that they did, you know, so that was kind of looking at it from the two different lenses. I preferred the way Hamilton did it.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was fun that the only obviously white character was King George III, and he was the bad boyfriend from Glee.
Was it intentional? I don't know if I'm the only one that noticed, but every time he talked, he spit. Was that an intentional thing that was like off of a historical thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that was intentional, because I understand, in fact, he did dribble a lot and spat and was.
Yeah. Yep, that's true. So
I figured it was, but I just every time he talked, I noticed it every time, and so I was like, that's got to have some sort of a historical background there.
yeah,
And his songs were kind of British invasion.
Regarding the business of having black actors portray all the white people, there weren't any black characters at all. And I think that the only mention of a black person was Sarah Hennings. Sarah Hennings, is that correct?
Sally, yeah, Sally Hemings. Yeah.
Sally Hemings.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there needed to be. It's just this kind of casual observation. But certainly, given the time, there would have been black slaves getting and fetching and doing all this other business. But you can't have everybody, and there it is. Just.
Yeah, and this gets to Eisenberg's point that is this subaltern, or is it, what's the term? She makes a quote from another historian, envelope subaltern or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, so a subaltern approach is it is an approach used especially by post-colonial historians that really focuses on the views of underrepresented groups in history, right? You know, historical actors who have not been given voices by historians, or their voices have not been shared by historians. That might be the best way to put it, or broadcasted by historians. And so Eisenberg's point is, okay, well, you have all of these actors portraying white historical figures. Is that really a subaltern perspective or not? And honestly, that to me was the most intriguing point that Eisenberg made. Mm-hmm. And it really gave me pause to think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's having minority characters portray elite characters, having minority actors portray elite characters doesn't strike me as being subaltern at all. There isn't a servant of any variety. There isn't there isn't a non-elite person in any scene that I can think of. Maybe some of the soldiers, I guess you could say are not, are not part of the elites, but the action is really limited to.
Right. I mean, even the women characters, it's very important to point out that the Schuylers were one of the wealthiest families, one of the most blue-blooded families in New York City. We're talking the creme de la creme in New York City, and that's part of the reason why Hamilton married a Schuyler, because he wanted to rise up. There you go. So, yeah. I mean, the flip side argument is that it gives, and this is the way Miranda approached it, it gives minorities a stake in American history, that is frequently portrayed as all white, right? I mean, that's why he made the choice.
Right. That they're claiming that they are part of the tradition that comes out of this, which is a legitimate point. And I think from that perspective, it was very successful. What do you think about the claim that Eisenberg makes at the beginning of her article, right in the first paragraph, that that the mainstream media sort of accepted this story as rigorously factual, and historically accurate, and not, and that would seem to kind of cut the bottom out of Benjamin Karp's argument that this shouldn't be taken as something that makes this claim, and apparently Miranda on the Charlie Rose show insisted that it was not only history, but it had a new, it was a new kind of revisionist history.
So can I challenge you, Ellis? Not that I disagree with you, because I do agree with you that having minority characters, kind of placing them in that era, in that history. If you argue that this is not actual history, or then you're saying that it's putting minority characters into history, but aren't we arguing that this shouldn't be taken as history?
Yeah,
I think you're
I agree with you.
I'm agreeing with Kate. I think that it is very clever on Miranda's part, because he's saying, that this is meta. This is not this is not a history-based movie. I mean, you wouldn't portray a Black person as a slave owner in in a Tarantino film, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can do it here, because this is not a film. This is Broadway.
I think another thing that we need to look at is, at present, in the theater, in ballet, in opera, high culture, there is a trend now to break down these racial barriers. Mm-hmm. And so it is really just only very recently that we are seeing Black prima ballerinas. Mm-hmm. That we are just beginning.
I want to go back to Kate.
Cross that barrier, which is difficult for us white folk. Oh my God. Wait a minute, we're watching Shakespeare, and isn't the only Shakespeare Black actor supposed to be Othello?
Right.
And right. So he has embraced that notion. And it causes for us, the people who go to high culture, who are predominantly white, this moment of unease, and this moment of reflection, and an urge to greatly more understand the character. Mm-hmm. So It's about what's going down now,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak.
Okay. I need to make this point because you directly questioned me, so I have to be able to.
No, I wasn't
Your
trying
question.
to like in any way, but
No. So okay. What I'm trying to get at though is I wasn't defending Eisenberg's point on that point. No, I think sometimes I'm not always clear when I'm playing devil's advocate and when I'm arguing something that I am personally arguing. I think that the choice to make these white historical characters minority is one of the things that, or to have them portrayed by minority actors is one of the things that is the most intriguing about Hamilton. I guess if I do have a gripe with Hamilton, it actually comes to the way that Hamilton, the character, is portrayed, which I
agree with you there. I was just kind of poking the bear, you know. I wasn't disagreeing with you on that. I think that the portrayal of these white elite founding fathers being portrayed by minority actors is a great thing. I have no objection to that whatsoever. I was just kind of, you know, I was just kind of trying to stir up the pot a little bit.
Well,
with questioning.
Of course they were able to do it because there are no actual subaltern characters in the production, right? There are no, indentured white servants. There are no slaves, right? Which, I don't even remember if there were any in 17. I imagine they managed to get them out in 1776, which would have been even more difficult because it's not a small stage, musical theater kind of a production. That must have been a real achievement. But talk about revisionist history. Let's talk about the 1776. I'm not have any slaves in it. But you can get away with a lot in theater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought the portrayal of Hamilton himself was the most problematic thing, probably, and the 1800 election. I liked kind of the part in the beginning during the Revolution where Washington's having his ass handed to him, and retreating across, being chased out of New York and losing, and which actually was all very accurate.
One of the things that I think is really interesting to bounce off what you were saying, Dan, is if you look at how Hamilton is portrayed and Jefferson is portrayed, it doesn't really there isn't that much of a difference of portrayal compared to the character politics of the 18th century themselves. I guess what I'm saying is, Hamilton in Hamilton is portrayed as, very articulate, quick-witted, deep-thinking, urbane. And then you've got Jefferson, who's portrayed as sort of like full of himself, right? And sort of a foppish figure. And isn't that exactly the way the Federalists, like in the 18th century, like to portray Jefferson? And I'm just wondering, like, you know, how much has actually changed? It's interesting to me that you still have in the 21st century the Hamilton camps and the Jefferson camps. and the people who are in the Jefferson camp, and this I think you all already know this, but if you don't, I will be 100% clear because I want to make sure everyone knows that this is my bias. I am definitely in the Jefferson camp, right? That is something that is hard for me to, I am sorry. I am being open and honest, full confessions here. I am all about Jefferson. So, so what I'm saying here is, you know, how much has actually changed in the 200 years as far as how these two individuals are portrayed? You see a caricature that has emerged in the 18th century, and that caricature is still holding true because the Jefferson camp, right, portrays Hamilton as, you know, conniving, elitist. You still see that in the historians who are Jefferson supporters.
Well, there and also there's a New York versus Virginia thing that I think you see a lot of the Jefferson camp at the time. You know, what they're putting on Hamilton is something that they're sort of ascribing to all New Yorkers, and that seems to me to have stuck in a way that when the Federalists are sort of attacking Jefferson and Madison and the Virginians, we've sort of lost track of that Virginian identity, and we think of that more as a sort of a Jeffersonian, you know, agrarian kind of idealistic identity. But there was, I think, at the time, the Federalists, one of the big things that they were down on was the Virginianness of the Virginians.
Yes, because, and I think part of the reason is Virginia was the Texas of the late 18th century, right? It had a very distinct identity, that it saw itself as its own country. And, you know, that, I mean, that's the way that Jefferson always referred to it, is the way Washington always referred to it. Virginia was his country. And that's not to say that there wasn't some of that with all of that generation, right? Because the entire country was much less interconnected, right? But Virginia saw itself as a thing apart, whereas, you know, New Englanders had some of a regional identity already in the 18th century. Deep South already had a regional identity. The West, what would become the Midwest, but Virginia viewed itself as its own thing. I mean, maybe parts of Virginia, I guess you could say, they were Chesapeake, right? Delmarva Peninsula. But there really was this idea that Virginia was, yeah, I think that's the best comparison. It was the Texas of the late 18th century. Does this mean, I'm looking specifically at Melissa, Kate, Emily. Have you been to Texas? Do you know what I mean when I say that?
My aunt's from Texas.
Okay. So,
So,
if you talk to the average Texan, why would you ever leave Texas? Everything's in Texas, right?
they have a separate as we've discussed in this meeting, I believe, their textbooks are different than textbooks in other places.
So I think you're right. That's definitely been lost. But I think if you're talking more broadly speaking, there is also reflected in Hamilton a division, a rural-urban division that is still very much present in American politics, and that's certainly still there. I don't know. I think it's so interesting that, and I guess it speaks to how long the shadow is of this, early 19th century, late 18th century political division between Hamilton and Jefferson, how deeply integrated it is into the American historical, that those archetypes, those stereotypical archetypes that were set up by the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans are really still reflected in the literature.
I do like how they in Hamilton portrayed the two parties kind of pinned against each other, and how Washington had said, don't let the parties divide the country, because that's something that still happens today, and is still referenced to today. George Washington warned against parties and stuff like that. So I do like how they included that, and how it was discussed in the musical. I would have liked to see more than just Hamilton, though, because I felt like it was Madison and Jefferson up against Hamilton, and that's how it was portrayed in the musical. And I would have liked to see other characters kind of supporting one side or the other, but
It's kind of funny, Adams doesn't even make an appearance, does he?
yeah.
Ladies, gentlemen, I have to leave.
Okay.
Been a great discussion, and let me know when the next one occurs. It'd be great
Absolutely. Will do. Thanks, Tom.
to.
See ya. Yeah, so it is 6 o'clock. Shall we think about wrapping up?
Yeah, I gotta go eat dinner now anyway, so I probably gotta go too.
Okay.
Yeah.
When are we doing another one of these meetings?